Hello, everyone. Our discussion today it will be focused on intercultural understanding and conflict transformation. So I'd like to start with a story. When I was an undergrad, I studied abroad in South Korea for a year. And once there was kind of an incident where I went to the international office because I needed something or I had a question. And so I walked in the door and I was going to go over to the person that I needed to talk to. And immediately the director of the international program, he started scolding me. And I was kind of shocked and taken aback. And, here I am being scolded in front of everybody in the office. And basically, he was explaining that it was very rude of me to come into the room and not greet everyone um, because it's a sign of respect. And this is what I didn't realize at that time is a Korean culture that you should give a greeting, not as hi, everyone pay attention to me, but as a sign of respect, especially as I am a younger person, in age compared to everyone else in the room, it's appropriate for me to, give kind of a greeting. In my mind, in my cultural view, it's kind of rude to walk in a room and say, and it's disruptive to, walk in and say, hi, everybody, and pay attention to me. But I tell you the story just to kind of highlight how a cultural difference and interpretation of what is appropriate in a certain situation can play a role in sparking a conflict. Um, so going back to our readings from Lederach, if you recall, he said that a transformational approach recognized that conflict is normal and continuous dynamic within human relationships. So just the fact that we have different cultural backgrounds, different histories, there is my own personal history of growing up within a certain culture. And then there's also the broader history of the culture in which I grew up. Um, that difference means we will see the world differently. Two people looking at the exact same thing will come to two different conclusions. And in getting to yes, if you recall, Uri and Fisher talk about the importance of seeing the interests which are behind the positions, right? In order to begin a proper negotiation. And those interests can be culturally motivated. An example I just want to give real quick, this is small island between Japan and Korea, and it's inhospitable island. I studied abroad in Korea, as I mentioned, so we learned to call these islands dokdo in the Eastern Sea. If you are from Japan or studied in Japan, you would know them as Takashima in the Sea of Japan. One neutral name used for them is the Liancourt Rocks, as you can see on this map here. So both Japan and Korea claim ownership over these rocks, over these islands, rather. And they have disputed this issue for hundreds of years. And actually, this picture down below is Korean citizens will travel to this island and they will make it's like a pilgrimage. They will wave flags, they'll play music, they'll take photos, and many see it as a civic duty to make this trip. The Japanese, for their part, will say that the Korean claim is not based on international law. So they each have very compelling historical arguments to back up a prior claim to these these islands. And if you approach this and you look at this, looking at their positions, you can look at, well, they want to claim ownership and the interests of territory, fishing rights, or other things like that. But there is also some deep cultural reasonings as well. For Koreans, the Japanese occupation was deeply humiliating, and there are still many unresolved feelings. Koreans are very proud of their culture, of their history, their heritage. Um, so the islands can also be kind of like a symbol of reclaiming that pride. Um, so then any documentation that the Japanese produce is seen with distrust, and negotiation is difficult. And it's a still unresolved issue. So this is just highlighting how the interests behind positions can be influenced by culture. Lederach continues in his book, a transformational approach seeks to understand the particular episode of conflict, not in isolation, but as embedded in a greater pattern. We talked about this several weeks ago, early in the course. Change is understood both at the level of immediate presenting issues and the broader patterns of issues. And looking beyond a particular issue, we can find viewpoints which are deeply rooted in culture. Intercultural understanding can go a long way toward getting a deeper glimpse into how people on each side of the conflict are thinking. How are they thinking? Why do they think that way? How are they interpreting the conflict that they're experiencing? Both sides are experiencing the conflict, but the interpretation might be totally different. And what are the cultural nuances informing that interpretation? And it's not necessarily about agreeing with the interpretation, but we have to first understand in order to move towards a more peaceful outcome, which is meaningful to both sides, right? And respectful of each interpretation and each experience of the conflict. So some will think that conflict between cultures will inevitably lead to violent clashes. Maybe you're familiar with Samuel Huntington, his famous piece on Clash of Civilization. And there's a lot more depth to it, but we don't have time you can look into it on your own as well. But his main thesis was that in the Cold War world, most important distinctions among people are no longer ideological, political, or economic, they are cultural. And he wrote, by the way, he wrote this, an article for the Foreign Affairs Journal in 1993, and he expanded that into a book, Clash of Civilizations, in 1996. So he predicted and described the great clashes that he saw that will happen between cultures. First between Islam and the West, and then also between Asia, China, and the United States. And by the way, I'm sure you're aware that, as I mentioned, this was published in 1996 and 1993. Just 5 years later, 9/11 happened in the US. So even though there was terrorism before that point, 9/11 changed everything. That terrorist attack and also the U.S. response to that tragedy. So, many people will point to 9/11 and the rise of Islamic extremism with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS and Taliban and Muslim Brotherhood and many other groups as proof that Huntington was right, that this clash between civilizations is inevitable. And some go so far as to say that the West and Islam are inherently incompatible and doomed to always clash. And critics of Huntington's view have said that maybe this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it only promotes greater division and greater fear and xenophobia of different cultures. An alternative view is that cultural diversity and greater connections between cultures is actually good for humanity as a whole. It's mutually beneficial. It spurs us to develop and grow to greater heights because of learning from each other. And appreciating other cultures sometimes helps us to understand our own culture and appreciate our own cultures better. One critique of Huntington's view I'd like to present to you comes from Benazir Bhutto. She was the first woman to be elected as prime minister of a predominantly Muslim nation, that's Pakistan. She had a tumultuous career. She and her husband faced some allegations of corruption. She worked against some brutal military regimes in Pakistan, and she was assassinated in 2007. But despite many of the questions surrounding her career, she was a highly accomplished, intelligent woman and advocate for peace building and peaceful reconciliation. So she wrote this book, Reconciliation, Islam, Democracy, and the West. Very interesting book, in case you'd like to dive deeper into this topic. So, as she says, in one part, in the past, the perception of diversity as a threat was, and in some cases still is, at the very core of war. Ethnic cleansing, armed conflict, or so-called religious classes were all based on the perception that diversity is a threat. Diversity without dialogue may engender more exclusiveness. Therefore, a dialogue between those who perceive diversity as a threat and those who see it as a tool of betterment and growth is intrinsically necessary. So we need dialogue and we need understanding between our cultures in order to grow together as humanity. So when we counter each other and across cultures and across, quote unquote, civilizations, and come up against our differences, which way will we go? And if we're looking at these two sides, clash or reconciliation, it's not about deciding who is right and who is wrong, which theory is correct, because each of these views has its merits, and you can likely find solid evidence to support each one. And those of us who have studied the peace philosophy of Father and Mother Moon, and those of you who will be completing your studies at HJ International in Peace Studies, what will we contribute to this conversation? And personally, I believe that rather than putting our observations or arguments for one side or the other, we have to seek another way. Which will it be? Really, it could go either way. And it comes down to how we respond to each other as fellow human beings. Can we see the cultural nuances behind our interactions? Can we see how a particular party's approach to a conflict or interpretation of the conflict is informed by their culture? Can we see how my cultural lens might be contributing to greater conflict? Sometimes we have to realize that we ourselves are wearing glasses. That's the lens through which we are seeing the world around us. So, and it's not about deciding or determining which interpretation is better or more right. They're different, and the actions of the other side might be very confusing until we start to also look at the cultural aspects. Culture is connected to history, to ethnicity, to religion, to nationality, to geography. So understanding is the first step. So I want to present to you a few points I think are important for intercultural understanding. And this isn't an exhaustive list. I'm sure you can add more to it. And look forward to hearing your contributions in the assignment. So first is to pay attention to language surrounding conflict. Actually, Lederach wrote another book, very good book, Preparing for Peace, Conflict Transformation Across Cultures. Focuses mostly on training people for conflict transformation. But in this book, he says that conflict is connected to meaning to knowledge, and knowledge is rooted in culture. I understand culture to be rooted in the shared knowledge and schemes created and used by a set of people for perceiving, interpreting, expressing, and responding to social realities around them. I therefore assume that understanding the connection of social conflict is culture. The connection of social conflict and culture is not merely a question of sensitivity or awareness, but a far more profound adventure of discovering and digging into the archaeology of accumulated shared knowledge common to a set of people. So he talks about the words, the metaphors, the parables, the stories, the sayings of a group of people for how they assign meaning. What is the language being used to describe the conflict or the issues surrounding the conflict? Are there any proverbs or common sayings people use and how they perceive their relationship with others or with the wider world? How do people attach meaning to their history and to their current situation? You can think about your own culture. For example, if you recall in Getting to Yes, there was a story of the negotiation of the American hostages in Iran in 1980. And Urian Fisher tells the story of how the UN Secretary General flew to Iran to negotiate the release, and he said on arrival that I have come as a mediator to work out a compromise. Now, in English, these words are positive, but the Persian translation of his words have a negative meaning. Compromise has a meaning of compromising one's integrity, and mediator implies a meddler. So a radio station broadcasted what he said, and then next thing you knew, there was an angry mob throwing rocks at his car. So this is about language, the language around conflict and how people interpret the world. For example, a proverb that I always think of is in Korea. They say that when whales fight, the shrimp's back is broken. So this can kind of give us an idea that maybe they see themselves as the shrimp among whales. China, Russia, the Soviet Union, United States, Japan. So in light of this viewpoint, if we look at maybe the actions of North Korea, we might think that, well, maybe they're motivated by this understanding that, well, we're not going to be the shrimp with the broken back anymore. Letterock tells the story of doing an exercise in Mexico, and they're brainstorming words that are around conflict. And he said, okay, one person almost immediately suggested that the word desmadre represented in a nutshell the Mexican experience of conflict. It translates as disorder or chaos, but literally means to be without a mother. In the course of discussion, we probe not only the images and meanings of chaos and disorder, but the more profound significance of mother or her role in the family in maintaining stability and of mothers as peacemakers. Practically, it begins to raise a more explicit understanding of the central role of women in the resolution of family conflict in Latin America. It highlights the significance of women's natural networks as a resource for handling conflicts and women's key conciliatory role of holding people together. So with kind of understanding the culture behind using this word desmadre, they kind of revealed or unveiled that actually the women have a central role in and potentially could have even more of a role in conflict resolution, their role of keeping the family together. So maybe a negotiator or a mediator would think about how to utilize the women in their approach to a particular conflict situation, understanding this about culture in Mexico. Second, when thinking about conflict transformation and intercultural understanding, the way we act in a particular conflict, how we react, how we interpret the conflict may be different based on the culture. Intercultural conflict style model comes from Hammer. It was in your reading for this week. So when we're attempting to relate to each other authentically across cultures, the ways we interpret the conflict and how we respond can be different, as I said. And the differences in style, if we don't recognize those differences, we can create problems. We misinterpret the other person's intentions, and the conflict can escalate. Based on working in the area of conflict resolution, Hammer developed this matrix between direct and indirect cultures, and between emotionally expressive and emotionally restrained cultures. And from that emerges four general styles for how people tend to engage in conflict across cultures. Before we go into details, I want to point out that understanding this is not for the purpose of becoming like a robot or knowing so that we can know exactly how to respond in every situation. And it's not for developing stereotypes of people from different cultures, putting people in a box thinking like, oh, you're from this culture, that means you're like this and this. It's just for the sake of general understanding. So general tendencies, so that we can, when we look at people and how they're responding to a conflict, we're not getting the wrong idea about their intentions. We can see their authenticity more clearly, and we can also maybe even take a step back ourselves and see how my conflict style is not being interpreted the way that I want it to be by the other side. So actually, Hammer points out that in times of high stress and high uncertainty, many people, even highly trained conflict resolution professionals, they will fall back on their culture's general conflict style. And despite all the training, the procedures that they know, in that time of stress and high emotions, they fall back on their culture's general ways of responding to conflict. So here's a quote from the reading. He says that conflict involves two core elements. First is the substantive disagreement. Um, there's the what happened and how and why, and there's the element of misperception and misunderstanding. It also involves disagreements over goals, values, other issues. What is the issue? That's the substantive disagreement. Second, conflict interaction is stressful and involves some degree of emotional upset and even distress. So the matrix looks at these two areas. From this, we get direct versus indirect a conflict style or communication about disagreement, and emotionally expressive and emotionally restrained in response to the distress. So let's just take a look at this. Moving this forward, there we go. So first, direct cultures tend to focus on the specific words used when discussing the particular issues. Direct cultures emphasize direct, precise, explicit language in order to increase understanding of the issue or the disagreement. Direct cultures, they want to know, what are we talking about? What is the issue? What's the core issue? And verbally explaining is very important. And we have to verbally explain it in order to avoid misperceptions. And direct cultures prefer face-to-face methods to resolve conflict, and also places a high value on accuracy, honesty, and speaking one's mind. And as can be expected, direct cultures also value persuasion based on logic, based on these clear words, and also of objective facts. In contrast, indirect cultures look outside, read between the lines, so to speak, look outside of the verbal messages to identify meanings in one another's statements and actions. So maybe an indirect culture would look at body language, tone of voice, of the context in which the conflict is happening. There's greater attention to history, context, nonverbal behaviors. Words are used more for social expectations and less for communicating actual needs or beliefs. Direct statements can feel like a threat to harmony, tending to use hinting, analogies, historical examples, or metaphors to talk around the agreement. They won't directly talk about it. But we're hinting and hoping the other person interprets and can see between the lines similarly. Indirect cultures will also place a high value on saving face, or preserving smooth relationships, maintaining harmony, and restoring community solidarity. And then the other aspect of how different cultures deal with emotional distress. So that is expressive or restrained. The emotionally expressive cultures value overt displays of emotion. This is from Hammer. Emotional upset is controlled by externalizing or letting out the emotions. It's important to let it out. Let me know how you feel. And then hiding the emotion is actually what escalates the conflict, because we don't know how the other person feels about it. So for expressive cultures, advice to calm down can feel offensive because it challenges their sense of authenticity. Emotional authenticity is central. It's important to be emotionally, expressive. Tell me how you feel. And that's necessary for resolution. And then conflict can de-escalate when both parties feel each other's sincerity, when both parties feel they know and each person is expressing their real emotions about the situation. And then we can move forward. Emotionally restrained cultures, on the other hand, focus on keeping emotional control, even if you're upset. Strong feelings are hidden to avoid upsetting the other party, and restrained cultures are uncomfortable with overt expressions of emotion. So maintaining calm in the face of stress or upset or very difficult situations, though that's very important. Being able to be calm, that's what communicates sincerity. So you can already kind of see how these can butt against each other, where the expressive is saying, well, we have to express, that's how I express my real emotions, and that is my sincerity. Whereas the other side is hiding the emotions, and that is expressing sincerity, showing that this conflict is important and we need to work on it. And for restrained cultures, more overt displays of emotion send a message of insincerity, questionable intentions, and seen with suspicion. Maybe you can see where your culture falls, or you yourself feel more comfortable with one side or the other. And like any framework, it's not going to be perfect. It can't encompass every bit of human experience, but maybe you can find some affinity somewhere. For myself, definitely right away, I can tell that Western European countries, Americans, I'm an American, and I can see us in the direct style as well as the emotionally restrained. And I feel it myself. Just reading the description of indirect cultures already sounds very frustrating to me. In America, we say, we value honesty and openness, and just tell me what you're thinking. So from this matrix comes 4 different conflict styles. And that is direct and emotionally restrained, indirect and emotionally restrained, direct and emotionally expressive, and indirect and emotionally expressive. So let's look at each one of these. The conflict style, which is emotionally restrained, but also direct in communication, focuses on resolving issues through focused problem-solving processes. There's a focus on objective facts and information. These are very important. We need to have a logical argument. Don't let the emotions get involved here. We have to lay out the facts and talk about it. Discussion style, we have to talk about it. And this is from Hammer. Clarity and expressing one's goals or position is important, as is maintaining emotional calm when tensions rise. A strength of the style is the ability to confront problems directly, elaborate arguments clearly, and so with the intention that the other party doesn't misunderstand. The weakness is it can be seen as logical but unfeeling, and this overemphasis on verbal clarity without recognizing the other emotional or relational concerns. And you can see some examples of different cultures that tend to be this discussion style. Engagement style also emphasizes being verbally direct, but is more emotionally expressive. This might be somebody who will tell you exactly what they feel about you without holding back. Some of the strengths of this style is an ability to provide detailed information, the clear messaging and sincerity with the emotional expressions. They can give the sincere, this is what I'm feeling, as well as the clear messaging on the details. And there's a more positive sense that sharing one's feelings is how conflicts are resolved successfully. A weakness is it can be seen as concerned about the feelings of others, whereas engagement style might be very comfortable expressing their own feelings, but there might be a feeling that they're not listening or trying to receive the feelings of others. It can be seen as domineering and rude sometimes. So people of engagement style might prefer to be direct in their language, but would be more emotionally expressive. They might use their body language more to express how they feel about the issue, rather than just putting the facts on the table. They're also putting their emotions there as well. The indirect communication style, while being emotionally restrained, is accommodation. And you can probably tell already from the name, is very accommodating towards others, the more willing to put oneself back in order to accommodate the concerns or the issues of others. This style emphasizes ambiguity, stories, metaphors, and using third parties to soften the conflict, because it's an indirect style. It's more comfortable of working through a mediator. Some strengths of accommodation style is an ability to consider alternative interpretations of ambiguous messaging, because the direct style might be a little bit too focused on these are the facts, whereas an indirect style might be a little bit more willing to see that, okay, well, these other people have a different interpretation and it's different than my own. And there's also a sensitivity to the feelings of others in the party. Some weaknesses are a difficulty in spelling out one's own opinions and can appear to be uncommitted or dishonest. And you can see some examples of cultures that tend towards this style of conflict. And then finally is that dynamic style. That's indirect communication while also being emotionally expressive. Uses indirect messages, strategic hyperbole, repeating one's position, stories, metaphor, humor, and also third-party intermediaries. Prioritization of concerns may be communicated more through the level of emotional expression than a direct statement of what is important and what is not important. The strengths are the people of a dynamic style are skilled at observing behavior and nonverbal cues. They can see, they interpret the tone of voice or the body language of other people. They're comfortable with strong emotional displays. They're comfortable with people interjecting to offer solutions. Some of the weaknesses is they can be seen as unreasonable or too emotional or volatile and don't get to the point. And you can see some examples of cultures that tend to be this way in conflict. An example of this would be when we see stories of anti-American protests in Iraq or Iran or other countries around the world and or Middle Eastern countries, and demonstrators will burn flags, American flags, or they will make a model or a figure of an American leader and they'll burn it. And this symbol is important, burning the flag or burning this this model of a leader. And that's the indirect nature, but it's also emotionally intense in expression. In contrast, in the West, protests are more about carrying signs and with your views on them, expressing clearly what you want and what you're seeking in the protest. So we don't really understand this emotional display. So, you know, Western media, we tend to portray Middle Eastern people as volatile. You know, they see this weakness, or it's very difficult to meet heart to heart because of these differences in conflict style. So I just hope that this can shed a little bit of light on how you or how people in your culture approach conflict, and perhaps how others of a different culture might have a style different from you. And this is a tool, just like any tool, it should be used intentionally and where it is appropriate and useful. Hammer concludes that differences in the way we attempt to authentically interact with one another when we disagree and are frustrated or angry are often misinterpreted as negative personal characteristics. Thus, discussion styles are falsely judged to be unfeeling. Engagement approaches are evaluated as dominating and rude. Accommodation styles are dismissed as uninvolved and unclear. And dynamic styles are avoided because the individual is thought to be volatile and unstable. So we want to seek to see each other authentically, especially when there are times of conflict and there's stress and there's many strong emotions involved. So I just want to conclude this lecture by saying I think there's a great need for more people who have the perspective of peace that Father and Mother Moon have taught throughout their leadership. That is seeing each other from God's perspective, and that we are one human family despite any differences of race or religion or culture. So, and not only have that perspective, but also have the tools to apply it in practical terms. How can we treat each other as brothers and sisters, or with dignity and respect? What does that mean? How do my words and my actions change based on that perspective? And that's not accomplished by insisting on our own way or our own interpretation or our own cultural lens, that insisting that it's the correct one. We have to realize that when my cultural lens is providing a particular interpretation and how that might be different from what someone else sees. It's not about determining who's right and who's wrong, but first just understanding that and that's a huge step, just understanding. That opens the way to finding more creative solutions instead of, you know, like in this example, seeing the discussion styles as unfeeling. Instead, seeing the strengths of that style and working around it, working with it. You know, instead of seeing dynamic styles as volatile and trying to avoid them, maybe we'll see it as, you know, this is actually a benefit to, you know, express exactly what you feel and put it out there on the table, and, you know, work with that in each unique way. Yeah, and with that understanding, we can open the way for more creative solutions, and we can approach a situation or a conversation in a way that communicates respect and honoring the other side. So I just want to conclude this from Father Moon. This is from a speech titled Today's Intellectuals and Religion, given in 1981. I'm sorry, I think on the recording, I'll probably blocked. Let me see if this helps. Today, the desires of human beings are fragmented. The economist interested In the economy, the intellectual craves knowledge, the politician wants power. The desires of each individual, of families, of clans, all have their circumstances connected with the past, yet they're pulled around according to the situation. People are doing things, but everything falls short. That's because human desire has a fundamental problem. Everyone demands to be the subject partner. Each person is saying, I'm the subject partner, and so you have to attach yourself to me. If every existence tries to center on itself, it will cease existing. If it revolves only inside this cramped space, it will cease existing. It confronts itself. The formation of the great universe becomes impossible. If God exists, what would God think? He would say that in order for each existence to connect to the universe and continue living, it needs to live for others. Everything has to go along the path of living for others. So thank you very much for your kind attention. I look forward to reading your reflections on this week's assignment.